Alright, so now we're going to take a look at how to use different types of joints in Unity. So let's take a look at what we have here. I have two different objects here, and they both have two different types of joints attached to them. If I hit play, you can see that this one has a hinge joint, it's rotating along a axle, and this one has a spring joint, which basically mimics a object being attached to a spring. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and recreate these cubes so we can start off from scratch. I'm just going to go ahead and make these into flat looking cubes. And I'm just going to duplicate it. Alright, first let's go ahead and add a rigid body to both of these. Alright, and then we're going to add a spring joint to this one and a hinge joint to this one. So with the first one selected, go to Component, Physics, and we're going to go down to Spring Joint. Alright, so here are the settings for the spring joint. Now the first one says Connected Body. If you don't have any other object that you want this connected to, you would just leave this blank. So if you have another game object that you want it connected to, let's say another cube, then you would go ahead and select that cube in here. But we're not going to go ahead and add anything else. We're just going to leave it as is. Alright, for anchor, right now it's set to 0.5 in the Y. So if we increase this, you can see that it raises it up a bit. So you can make this spring larger or smaller depending on what you want. Same thing with the X and the Z. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and change these back to 0. And for spring, this determines our springiness of this joint. So you can increase this or decrease it. So let's go ahead and go with 3. And then the damper basically determines how much it's going to slow it down as it's moving around. Then we have our minimum distance and our maximum distance. Basically, these are the minimum and max distances in which that spring joint would activate. So if it's below that distance, then it will not activate. Same thing with the maximum distance. Then finally, we have our brake force and our brake torque. So with joints, we have an ability to break that joint. So we have a brake force applied to this object. It'll eventually break that joint off once it reaches that value. Same thing with the torque. So if this object is rotating too fast, it'll eventually break off the joint. But right now it's set to infinity for both, meaning that it will never break off. Let's go ahead and hit play. And we can see that it's acting as if it's being held by a spring. Alright, so that is the spring joint. Now let's take a look at the hinge joint. So with this one selected, go back up to Component, Physics, and we're going to go ahead and pick a hinge joint. Alright, now if you take a look at the top of your cube here, you should see like a little arrow being embedded into our object here, and it's pointing towards the x-axis. Now this is based off the x-axis of the local parameters of this cube. So once again, we have our connected body. Since we don't have anything attached to it, you could use something like a building if you're trying to create a door. But we just have we're just going to go off the world itself, so this is going to attach the actual hinge to the world scene here. Alright, the anchor is set at 0.5 in the Y here as well. You can increase this to make the joint a little bit more visible, and you can see that it's pointing that way. Alright, so now we have our axes. Now this determines the axle on which that object is going to rotate upon. So right now it's going to rotate this way. So if we set the axis to say 0 in the X and 1 in the Y, now it's going to rotate basically around this axis. So if we take a look, it's going to rotate this way. Same thing with the Z. If we change this to 1, it's going to rotate side to side this way. So let's go ahead and try it with the X axis. Alright, so now we have use spring. Basically what this is going to do is once this starts rotating back and forth like this, it's going to have an ability to come in contact with a spring-like object. So it could swing backwards and hit a spring-like object right here, and it will automatically bounce back forward, creating a force effect onto our object. So you can check this on if you want to try it out. I'm going to go ahead and leave it as default. Now you have your spring parameters here as well. You can increase the spring value, the damper, and the target position. The target position basically determines where it's going to be located. So you can have it very, very close to your object, or you can have it very far away. Then we have the motor. If you select this, it'll basically add a motor-like velocity to our object. So you can continue having a kind of like a constant force applied to our object here. Then we have use limits. If you have use limits, you can essentially set the limits for how far forward and how far backward that object will be rotating. Then we have the minimum bounce and maximum bounce. And once again, this mostly applies to things like the spring. So that will determine how much bounce it has once it hits that spring. And then we have our brake force and our brake torque. So you can have this set to a smaller number. We could say 0.01. And let's go ahead and hit play and see how that works. Oh, I forgot to add something. So let's go ahead and select our box. And now we need to go ahead and make sure that it will actually rotate along that axis. So let's rotate it upward a bit and try it out. Alright, so the issue we were having is that the brake force was set to 0.001. Basically means once that rigid body applies a force to that hinge joint, it'll automatically brake. So 0.01 basically means it's going to break off right when it starts to have gravity applied to the object. So that force of it falling to the ground is actually greater than 0.01. So if we change this to infinity, and you can see it starts swinging. So you can tell that that was the brake force being applied. If we set this to say 1.1, press enter, let's see if it has an effect. And once again, that gravity of that rigid body is greater than 0.1, so it's going to break off. Alright, so that is the hinge joint. So now we have a spring joint and a hinge joint. Now you can use these for multiple types of things in your game. The hinge joint, obviously you can use it for doors or anything like that. The spring joint, you can have it for anything that you want, basically hanging. So that is the basics of using the joints in your game.